Today, I'm going to walk through the why and the how in relation to law firm performance management and KPI programs. Some organisations will already have some element of balanced scorecards in the mix, or may have already looked at introducing heat maps as part of their review and management of law firms, but we'll touch on that throughout today's session. So before starting, I think it's important to note that every company will be in a different state. So everyone on this call will be starting at a different point. Some of you will have a legal ops team and a dedicated legal procurement professionals, and your legal team will have that full support. Others will be in the position where essentially the relationship still rests with the legal team, and legal procurement does support, but potentially is looking and wanting to do more. So I think for the purposes of today's session, we're looking more at the background of why and how you would want to set this up. And I suppose for that basis, it does better suit those who are at the start of their journey, or have started and are just looking for a little bit more guidance as to whether they're on the right track. The principles we run through very much need to be tailored to each spend type. We'll be going through the reason to have KPIs and a more data-driven approach to management of your firms. And it's very much suited to more the high volume legal spend, so litigation, employment matters, certain types of insurance claims for that sector. And this same standard of data-driven approach won't really apply to all of your work types. So you'll measure your high volume work completely differently to the way you measure your M&A transactions, for example. You need to tailor your programs across the piece, but make sure they dovetail together to give you that combined program. So when we're looking at why to do this in the first place, we need to step back really. And when talking about performance management and KPIs, there's often two camps. When we are out talking to clients around the world, there's those who immediately get it. They immediately see why you would want to do it. And there's those who don't, for various reasons, and just don't believe this kind of approach can be applied to legal services with any real success. And sometimes that's born out of a bad experience or a lack of a decent strategy really on how to deliver what you need. I think this kind of work has been given a bit of a bad rep in some camps due to the level of expertise needed to succeed. I think you would need to understand the subject matter and the stakeholders involved. You need to understand to a decent degree what your legal team deem to be a good lawyer and why. What does good legal advice as a full package look like for your organisation? And based on the firms you've chosen to work with, how can you measure the firms are delivering that level of performance consistently? In a market where firms are looking to increase rates across the globe, how do you as a procurement team continue to show that the business is delivering value and savings where possible? So what we need to do is take a step back from the hourly rate and AFAs and looking purely at pricing, and understand that performance of a law firm is intrinsically linked to the result it achieves and coupled with their cost to get that result. So what does value look like for your business? And I think it's quite a straightforward question, and I don't think anybody would argue that it's not important. But I think when you sit down and try and make, let's say, a formula that would give you the answer to that, it is very difficult, but very, very powerful at the same time. So if I give you a very basic example, where you may have sort of a high volume of litigation matters, you split them between two firms, one with slightly lower rates than the other. What you can get using your data is the ability to look at those firms and not look at what they cost you in terms of their fees, but what they got as a result. What did they settle those cases for? What were the damages? What were their costs in addition to that? Looking at the total cost of that matter to your business and who got the best outcome. And I think we do this for clients all the time, and the outcome is different every time. So you can't always guarantee one thing or the other. But I think what's important to note is that obviously the firm with the cheaper rate doesn't always get the best result. And I think that's where legal teams particularly can get frustrated with focus only on the hourly rate, because it doesn't give the whole picture. It doesn't give them the right advice necessarily, or the best performance. And I mean, I think obviously if you undertake an RFP process and you select your firms, you should be fairly confident that they're able to give you the service you require. But the reality is that's not the case. Especially if you're taking on new firms or firms in different areas, but even, you know, actually where they've been working with you for some time. I think if you've not critically looked at their performance as against the peers within their panel for you, you don't know who's performing well and who isn't, and who deserves to continue working with you guys. So this kind of analysis really is sort of the holy grail of law firm appointment, value delivery, value pricing, just general management of spend. But at any one time, you should be able to justify why you're using any certain firm and the value they deliver. It means you can step away from just looking at hourly rates and negotiating on hourly rates as the sole source of saving, even just looking at AFAs. I mean, I know obviously the hourly rate is still the main way to pay for a lawyer. Many organizations shift and put in place as many AFAs as possible, but it still leaves that question: who's delivering the best? Who's giving you the best as a business? Who's advising you and getting you the best result? It is very difficult to achieve this well, and many, you know, we've seen many organizations try, but in reality end up with a whole host of pretty arbitrary data points and anecdotal feedback that may or may not drive some change, but does it drive the right change? And we'll spend much of today's session really walking through at a very high level the strategy you'll need to consider if setting up a program from scratch, or just sort of sense checking what you've got going on at the moment. It's important to note that the engagement you'll need will be across the board. So before embarking on this kind of program, you need buy-in from your legal team, any legal ops teams, procurement, and you need to present them with this why do we do this, and make sure they do fully support it. The results you can achieve with this process are only possible if those who control the spend in reality are willing to implement the changes that are recommended. So if a firm is underperforming, based on your agreed parameters, the whole team need to agree what that means. And does it mean you stop working with them? You look at putting in place an improvement plan. You have transparency discussions with them. I think we've often seen clients where certain parts of the business really buy into this, want it to work, but then in actuality, those, maybe the legal team or those that are instructing the lawyers, they just don't buy into sort of an evidence-based decision-making process. So if somebody doesn't, you could invest an awful lot of time for very little really, other than, you know, a host of data sitting in your systems. So if we take a look now in a little bit more detail at the key parts, I suppose the foundations to setting up this kind of program and where each part of it slots in. Obviously, with a lot of, I mean, with everything today, data plays a key part, but only in certain work types. I mean, well, more or less, it takes a big part in your high volume work types, a lesser part in your more complex matters. And again, that's part of the program design. You've also got your 360 feedback. So that's taking feedback from your side and the firm side, sharing it, learning from it, and putting in place any changes that are required. You've then got the KPI design itself. So you kind of need to do some of this looking at the result and working backwards really. So what is it? What does value look like to your business? What is a good lawyer? Figure that out and then understand, okay, what data points do we need? What are we going to measure? So what's important to us? And then you start measuring it. And again, it's not underestimating that this is a program and it will need resource to make sure it works. It's understanding what that reasonably is and is it worth the investment for your organization. You'll then, once you measure them, you'll obviously come away with action points. So the idea being you'll look at your firms, you'll understand who's performing well, and then you'll make some decisions based on that. So obviously those that underperform, you move work away from them. Those that look like they've got a total cost of case that's larger than their peer in that bracket, you move work to the one that is more cost effective. And then as a result of that, you measure the savings and efficiencies that come from it. Ultimately, what it should give you really is a very holistic approach to getting the best value legal advice. So that's looking at quality of the advice and the cost of the advice. And this, if we just look, is a bit of an example, again, a very, very basic example of what we mean, and really just sort of driving home the real importance of doing some of this work. And obviously this example won't apply to everyone on this call, but the principle will. So if we look here at the hourly rates of firm A and firm B, and then if we look at what firm A did, so firm A was instructed on a matter, the value of this litigation was around 30,000, apologies for the pounds, let's say dollars. It was resolved within 50 hours. So that was the total cost was the 17,000 plus 25,000 of damages. That's what their cost was. If we look at how firm B handled a claim of a similar value, they resolved it in 20 hours. It was led by a partner, so it was heavily partnered time in terms of staffing model, but their costs were less and they actually settled it for less because he was an experienced negotiator. He'd seen it before, let's say, for argument's sake. And it was done quicker because there was no supervision, there was no duplication between various staff members. This is just an example, and obviously this is not indicative. I'm not trying to say that everything partner-led is more cost-effective or that this would always be the case. And obviously every single case is different. So this is where this works particularly well in your high volume area, where you can bracket value of claim or case much more effectively, and by and large you can make assumptions that this work type will have similar legal issues, will be of a similar complexity, and this is where it really allows you to see, well, actually we should use firm B for this work type. So let's say this bracket was $0 to $50,000 and firm B consistently had a lower total cost, you would look to move work to them. And then you would, as I'd mentioned in the life cycle earlier, you would measure that as a saving and you would look to actively move new instructions to them. So the data to get to this point, we obviously work with a lot of clients as a partner on their data collection, but outside of that, we've advised lots of clients who do it themselves, and I think a lot of those out there who already do it predominantly rely on data from their law firms and in spreadsheet format. In all honesty, I think most organizations have pretty poor internal data to allow the granularity of review I'm talking about here. There's just not enough sort of very granular data within your systems that you capture. I mean, I think some areas, there's obviously some parts of the business world where noting this kind of information is particularly important, but by and large it's not. And so by and large, most of our clients historically, if they've done this before, or if they're asking a partner to do it, they'll rely on the law firm giving data and in spreadsheet form. What you can do, and obviously it is more secure and more less expensive, is partner with someone to collect that data in a more sort of secure fashion. And thereby removing, I suppose, a lot of the cleansing risk. I think people underestimate the level of data cleansing that is required, no matter how well you build your data set, how much guidance you give your law firms, there is still a very, very high level of cleansing that's required to ensure that you can get real meaningful analysis out of what's given to you. And just before we leave the data point, I think it is important to note that it's really need to sit down at the outset and understand what you're trying to achieve, because the data is the first thing to do. You have to start collecting the data. And to some extent, I mean, we've worked with clients where we've collected data for 12 months before they've got enough closed matters to draw any meaningful analysis out of it. So you need to get on that straight away. However, you really need to think through those data points. You need to sort of think about the end. You need somebody involved who understands what the analysis will look like. I think another frequent failing of those who are attempting these kind of programs is trying to get too much data. So they sit down and they think, yeah, we'll need this, we'll need that, that'd be interesting. And yes, it would be, and often it is, but you don't have a team of data analysts sitting there ready to crunch this huge amount of data that could come back from you from the firms. So I think that's why it's constantly bringing everybody back to, okay, what is value for you? What is it you care about? Because it's all good and well understanding X, Y, and Z, but if you're never going to make a decision off the back of that, or it doesn't feed in to your ultimate decision-making process, why are you asking it? I think I would advise anybody to make sure they constantly ask themselves, okay, what are we going to use that for? Why do we need that? Because in all fairness, the law firms go to great cost to provide this. Certainly in Europe, most firms would do this free of charge, the data collection with large clients, and they will be used to providing monthly reports of data. But it is at great cost to them, and they set up entire teams to provide this kind of information to their clients. So really make sure you're going to use what they give them, what they give you. And also, again, the analysis. So even if you do have a full team of analysts sitting there waiting to get stuck into this data, have you got the resource then to action it all? You know, what are you going to do with it if they can tell you that, you know, X, Y, and Z, you know, this firm has this staffing model and they've won this many trials, this firm is settled before they've got to try X, Y, and Z in various jurisdictions around the world. Do you have the manpower to deal with that? Or do you need to break it down and start with one or two really key factors that would fundamentally decide where you would move work to, and then build up from there? So, for example, and we'll come on to this a little bit more in the session, but again, as a very, very basic example, if you're looking at very, very low value, let's say motor insurance claims, while you can measure life cycle, staffing model, closure rate, which most motor insurers, for example, would do, ultimately all you really care about is what is the total cost to the business. So, you know, when you stand back from it, we often say to clients, do you care if it's all partner time at, you know, at its most extreme, which you would rarely find on that kind of case, but let's say if their total cost is always less, which means they always settle the claim for less plus their cost than anybody else. To some extent, the model doesn't matter if the total cost is the best, because I think what you're seeing there is that you're getting the best result and the best cost. Even on a per hour basis, it wouldn't necessarily tell you that story. So blindly driving firms to reduce life cycles as a KPI, for example, you could be doing yourself a huge disservice. And it's most likely, yes, it will reduce your legal spend, but it could be doing huge amounts of damage to just the business bottom line because you're paying out more in damages on these pieces of litigation. Similarly, blindly looking to reduce partner time, albeit there's obviously best practices around staffing models and staffing leverage, could force firms as a result to build in more supervision time, more duplication, less overall efficiency than if they were allowed to do some more of the work at a senior level. I think most organizations just don't have the data to say which way they need to go. I think they make assumptions based on what I suppose sounds sensible using just hourly rate, but don't factor in performance at all. So these are all concepts that until you have the data, you may, once the data is collected, see that a firm with the lower partner time is also the quickest and the overall best. you may not. So I'm not trying to sort of draw any particular conclusions. What I'm saying is every one of your organizations needs their own data set to understand what their firms are doing and what would be best. So making evidence-based decisions is where you want to get to, and it's so much more powerful and compelling than trying to force the legal team to use certain firms just because the hourly rate is more competitive. So as part of, again, this program, you need to consider the 360-degree feedback, or just general feedback, either only from the firm side, but I think most organizations do value taking feedback from their stakeholders and giving it to the firms as well. So I think firms really do value that. As an example here, we can see that most organizations tend to divide, let's say, the high level, the kinds of feedback they would get. So you would look at the relationship aspects, and then you'd look at performance. And again, this is where Sylvia's book, we've obviously gone into a little bit more detail on this area, but fundamentally, the items there by and large come up with all companies. So we've got their commitment to working together, the transparency, compatibility, and innovation. And then there's some sort of statements there that you rank, and then they rank in respect of the opposite side, I suppose. And again, with performance, you've got, have they used the appropriate level of lawyer? Have we got a high standard of performance? They were quick to rectify any problems. Decision-making process is clear. They're commercial in their advice. They always advise. Balance between commerciality and legal position, which is important to a business. Their value for money. They understand the instructions. The quality of the advice is high, and they reserve or they budget or give pricing information accurately. However you draw that up, so whether you ask the firms to rate themselves and then you rate them, which is what we see more and more, because as I say, I do think the firms really value that. And as a result, you can look at the where you agree and where you disagree in terms of their performance, which is often quite interesting. We've sat on many sessions with law firms where the organizations are very keen to partner and make sure that the relationship works really well. And they're not looking to kind of discard anybody on a whim. They really want to give an opportunity to improve where there's just been a bit of a lack of communication around certain points. So here we can see where there's sort of larger divergence of opinion on the matter, it can be flagged and you can have a conversation. So for example, here we've got innovation where there's a difference in opinion. What I would say on all of this, and again, it comes back to being prepared and understanding your organization's strategy, because you can look at this list and think, yeah, that all sounds great. We'll have the same template. And, there's various things you can measure in terms of gathering feedback and, in a sort of survey-like format. There's innovation, there's client satisfaction, responsiveness, commerciality, general expertise, project management, pricing accuracy. Would you hire them again? That's quite a common, just sort of standalone question, really. There's billing compliance, timekeeper management, communication generally. There's sort of, the list can go on and on. But again, it's sort of what is important to you, what is critical, because otherwise you're asking everybody involved to fill out these surveys, and there's enough going around often. And you want real meaning to come out of it. Again, that's why we do see organizations who simply ask that question, would you hire them again on this type of matter? And then they gather any other sort of feedback, or they might just ask about certain standout lawyers, for example. And this is an example, again, a very basic example of a heat map, and it demonstrates really what we've just been discussing in a different visual format that's often, again, helpful to just drive conversations. So KPI reporting and the actions that would follow. So once you've got the data in place and you've got a program set up to gather feedback, you need to sort of mesh it all together, and you need to understand right, what are our KPIs? What are the indicators that we believe our law firms must hit? And if they don't, what's the repercussions? So this is sort of a bit of an example of, again, just an example really of the sort of things you'd start to bring together. So if your KPIs you agreed were those across the top, for example, so how many days between instruction and settlement, date of final invoice. So some of them will be to drive different parts of what we've looked at. So some of these KPIs will be to look at their speed of response time or their compliance with your SLA. Some of them will be to look at their legal performance. Some of them will be to look at their budgeting performance. And sort of you need to sort of map all of that together. But yeah, here we have other measurements around how many days from settlement till file closure. And then we've got reporting dates. Again, for example, some clients would expect to receive reports on their matters on a regular basis, and they measure that. So if a firm doesn't consistently perform, that's shown here. Again, measurement of accuracy of budgeting, which is important to most organizations. I think if you over budget consistently in certain industries, that is very detrimental. And obviously if you under budget in most industries, that's detrimental in terms of trying to manage your legal spend for the coming year. So I think that's really important to try and get a grasp for how successful a firm is with that. And then we have the total cost. And again, I think this to me is really the crux of most low volume kind of work. What does it cost the business? And it takes some effort to get to this point so that you're comparing like for like. However, if you can get there, then it obviously is quite a clear indicator of a law firm's and their peers' performance. Then you've got obviously average partner time, average sort of paralegal trainee time. And just to look at these in a little bit more detail, again, on a very basic level, we can see here, so if we look at life cycle, for example, and just to step back again, and I think I just need to reiterate that throughout, I don't believe that you can really use any of these in isolation to write off a firm or to give them more work, because they all mesh together. You need to understand how the life cycle has driven a certain performance. A long life cycle or a short life cycle is not necessarily in of itself good or bad. But we see here that the firm ABC settle and issue a final invoice, close their case in significantly less days than Gordon's Law. So we can see we've measured each of those metrics and they're all lower than this firm. Again, as mentioned, you can measure for SLA compliance, so how long before you receive the standard advice report from your law firms. And I think it is important, whilst it can be improved and perhaps it's not the reason to move away from a firm. I think at the end of the day, if you require in your contract and in your service level agreements with your firms a certain level of service, it stands to reason that you should at least sense check that they're doing that and they're not sort of just completely disregarding what you've asked of them, because, you know, making the assumption that those service level agreements were important to your organization, important enough to impose them on the firms. So here again, we can just very quickly see the result of that. Again, legal budget. So, you know, with certain data sets, you'll be able to see end result, number of changes of budget through the life of a matter, and try and then build the calculation that will allow you to see how accurate they are, how often they're right, how often they're under, how often they're over. Again, it is very important. It's easy to forget that, you know, managing the finance of a large organization is a big deal, and you know, legal spend often plays a huge part in that. And again, as mentioned, and I'm sure this is sort of a very common measurement, looking at the level of, we have partner and trainee. That's probably more sort of UK specific to have the trainee there, but you know, lower level, higher level of partner time, of staffing time, And you can compare, again, within the same type of instruction, the performance of firms on the same kinds of cases. And again, as I've mentioned before, this is not, I don't think, indicative of anything in particular. What it means is if you put it all together, what picture does it tell you? Ex-legal have the highest percentage of partner time, but what is their total cost? What is even their average legal cost per matter? What is the result they get off the back of using this model? And then, yeah, this is sort of just illustrating that exactly. So it's kind of putting together results and cost within a bracket that is comparable and looking at the averages so that you could see, okay, if you've instructed these 6 firms over the last year, they've all had a similar case type. This is what it cost us as a total, including their cost. You know, you can see David LLP is much cheaper. What you can do, obviously, that doesn't mean you just then throw in the towel with everyone else and put it all in that direction, but it allows for much more intelligent conversations around who should get the work. You know, you can delve into it a little bit more. You can understand why the average cost is less. What is it? Is it a true reflection that they're just more effective and more efficient? Do they use no partners? Do they use all partners? You know, what is it that's driven this? Is their life cycle amazing? What is it? That's just really helpful in case you want to share it with other firms. But if you dig into it and it is correct, then it leads that conversation around how to work with firms that give you the best result. And then again, you can look at it by different areas. I suppose different departments will vary, obviously, by work type. And again, this is kind of where it all sort of starts to feed in together and start to give you a bit of a picture. But fundamentally, you can start to build a little bit of a baseline for your organization around where average costs are for certain types of matters. So whether that's certain subcategories of property cases, certain subcategories of employment matters, and it means you can start to move towards the area of annual retainers or AFAs, or even just move and work to the firms that do the best. So just thinking through some of the most sort of frequently asked questions we get around this this area, I think most that have never done it before, it's just kind of where to start. Where do we start? There's lots of pieces of this. Which bit do we jump into? And I think the key part of it is obviously to design a strategy and a timeline. But most importantly, as I've sort of said throughout, is to work out what value is for each spend type, each legal type. And it could be hugely different for each work type. And that's why working together with the legal team and trying to establish what that is will help build buy-in, because they'll have been part of that process from the outset. Some types will be potentially incapable of using just data and trend analysis to help make decisions, because their volume is so low and the complexity is so high that it's impossible to really compare like for like in this sort of data-driven fashion. But that's not to say they can't have a KPI program and it can't be built to sort of dovetail with the other work types, so that everybody has an understanding of, okay, this is what we think value is, and this is how we measure it. And then when we've measured it, we critically analyze that. We say, yeah, that looks right, or actually that isn't right, but we know why. And then we take a course of action off the back of it. And more times than not, that will mean savings or efficiencies for the business. Another top tip, really, which I've mentioned throughout, is just to start small. So whether that's starting with the feedback program or the data collection, don't try and boil the ocean, and also be realistic about the resource you have for the work, which I said at the outset. The data will no doubt need cleansing. You need to create the reports, need to understand the analysis, and there'll no doubt be many iterations of it as you get to the really the crux of what you need out of the data. You know, when you start looking at this data, you can actually draw lots of conclusions, and you need to keep revisiting it to understand actually that's right for us. And just also build enough time to work with your firms on this, and for them to prepare their IT teams or their data teams to work with you effectively. I think if you're, as I'd mentioned, certainly here in the UK, it's very commonplace, these programs, more and more so, and the firms obviously need that time to let's say build an API feed to your data partner, or to just get their team in a position to pull this data from their systems. All doable, but it is an ask for them, it is a cost to them, so just make sure you kind of factor in the time they will need to action all of this. So now what we'll do now is we've got some poll questions which we will run through. Apologies, I was going to dot them around, but we will do them all, I think, right now. So Sylvia, do you want to?
Not a problem. So thank you. So the first poll question is, do you undertake performance management of your law firm? So very quick and easy yes, no answer. Second question is, if not, is it due to internal stakeholder resistance? And the answers are yes, no, or not applicable. So I'm going to leave it open for a moment. What do you think will be the outcome, Caroline?
I am not sure. I'm going to say no to performance management. I think it's a big undertaking.
But do you see that is it more happening, now in 2022 compared to maybe even a year or two ago? So is it trend up, or definitely?
I think so, because I think obviously historically, rightly or wrongly, there's such a focus on the hourly rate, and that being, it's something so measurable. If you get a reduction there, you can say that's a saving, and it can be locked in. I mean, that's almost regardless of the fact that the firm might that next year spend 20 more hours on every one of your matters to make up for that discount. But nobody looks at that. Nobody can really measure that without this kind of program. So I think more and more as the firms harden in terms of rate discounts, for example, we see clients thinking, right, okay, well, we get what you're saying. We do need to look at this differently, because we can't just keep taking, you might get a rate discount on your partner rate, but in reality you use 5% partner time. It's not a real saving. So I think organizations are taking that next step to try and join it all together.
Okay, well, I can tell you what the outcomes are of this poll, and then we also have raised hands and questions, so we'll get to that in a second. So I'm ending the poll now, and I will share the results. So if you would like to comment.
What have we got? Okay, so no, but high amount, yeah.
60%, so 60-40. 60% of you said no, you do not, I guess, yet undertake performance management, and 40% said yes. Of those 60% who said no, 60% again was NA, so not applicable. 25% said yes, it was due to internal stakeholder resistance, and 15% was no. So any further thoughts on this? And let me see who asked the question. Any further thoughts on this, Caroline?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that it's it is, I suppose, stakeholder resistance is a big deal, I suppose. It would be interesting to know the other reasons that sit behind that, but it's obviously the biggest resistance. It's the biggest problem with setting up this program, which is what we've come across that.
So yes, thank you. So Reggie had a comment. Reggie, if you can unmute yourself, if that's not possible, I'm going to read it. Reggie, last chance. Oh, there you go. Yes, perfect. Good.
Yeah, my only comment was it's on the performance management, it's a yes or no, and I don't think it actually it adequately captures things, because from our standpoint, yes, we do some performance management, but I question how effective is it and to what degree, right? And so I think there's an awful lot that needs to be done to make it really effective and useful. I think some attorneys internally are checking off certain boxes in the survey just to get the survey done, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, while I answered yes, we do, but honestly, I don't think it's real effective.
Yeah, I mean that is probably the case with huge amounts of the feedback surveys that are out there with all organizations. It's the same as any feedback survey, in all honesty. Anybody who works has too much to do, and I think and then it's kind of, what do you do with that when you know the data may not be that hugely reliable? How do you take that forward then?
Right. And not to boil the ocean, to the point that you said, because if you get your internal attorneys talking, there's a lot of conversation, right? Let's manage everything. Well, that
Exactly.
the program it explodes. It doesn't work then.
Exactly.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much,
Reggie.
Reggie. Lee, you had a question as well, and Jose, you raised your hand. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box. Lee.
Yeah, no,
you've got
thank
the
you, Sylvia.
microphone.
Hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, no, this has been a great conversation, and I was just kind of curious. You'd mentioned earlier on, some of the problems in, doing the comparison between two firms can be challenging because the output is different every time. And certainly, one of the resistances when you have comparing law firms is, well, I do things different. This is slightly different from this. So what are some of the methodologies or strategies you've seen in trying to create that perception that, yes, we're comparing apples to apples and it's not apples to oranges?
And is that from the firm's perspective when you're giving the feedback to them rather than the internal?
It can actually even be internal, even from the same stakeholder, where they treat two different firms doing relatively the same thing, but they have a different spin on how they are performing or working, et cetera.
I think, it's difficult. I think one of the things is obviously getting the legal team involved at the outset, and then messaging to the firms, this is how we're going to measure you. And I think it's, again, standing back from it and explaining to everybody involved, look, we know every case is different, but we're looking at averages and we're looking at trends, and we're breaking it down using these brackets. So whether that's value of the claim, whether that's complexity of the claim or matter, sorry. If you all agree on that internally, I think it then makes it much easier to keep pushing that message to the firms, because at the end of the day, I think it's no longer enough to just say, well, every single matter is different. I think you have to draw up the methodology for each work type, but I think it is part of getting the buy-in, and I think that's where a lot of these programs fail. It's because exactly what you said, you agree something, you put it in place, measure it, and then you still get that pushback of, well, that was slightly different, or this was slightly more complex, and that's where having a volume of data helps. So you have to invest in these programs for probably, I don't want to say the long haul, but it's not something you're going to get immediate results from. In all honesty, you're not going to click a finger and in 2 months have the answer, because you need to let the data develop so that you can stand behind it and say, well, look, we've looked at a year's worth of closed cases. You can't ignore that this firm is consistently less effective on this one point.
Thank
That's
you.
great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adrian, you had the next question, and then Jose.
Hi, actually, it wasn't a question. It was more a commentary about the firm relationship management or firm performance management. What I see, not just in our work, but in talking to others, is that it really does vary on the level of work related to the firm performance management, whether you have a panel in place or not. And also the question is the formality of the metrics. And so we do a lot of firm relationship management within our bidding processes and just in general. Now that we've moved away from hourly rates, to Caroline's point, the more you use, fee arrangements, the more you have to firm relationship management. and looking at your previous bids and performance during a matter is going to really make a difference in how you would approach going forward and how you manage firms during the bid process. And even it comes back to the actual matter management, which it depends on where you sit too, procurement or operations or an actual attorney role. And I think one of the things that's really cool about what's happening today is by utilizing more sourcing, more fee arrangements, and more data like Caroline's sharing, is that basically you can continually improve the performance of not only the firms, but the way you're managing them. So it's really a great evolution, but it is going to take years.
Yeah, exactly. It is going to take years. And I think that's why firms have to kind of get on, well, organizations need to first, buy into it, but then appreciate it will take that long. But it's the only way really to move forward. I think you have to start looking at the performance in more critical detail, especially like you guys with the moving towards a more consistent use of AFAs. Otherwise, you've no real control over it.
Actually, I do have a quick question now that I think about it. How many years of data would you actually recommend people look at to really truly get a best view of how they should continue managing?
I think it depends on volume, because obviously fundamentally you're looking at full life of a case. So you need to it's how quick do they close from start to end. With certain areas that can be a year, with others it realistically can be 2 to 3. And then you have to start bearing in mind that you're looking at data from a firm's performance 3 years ago. So you have to use it in a way that drives decisions, but not always necessarily about that firm. You're then looking at the data to understand what's the average cost for this kind of work type and what's the average staffing model. So it's kind of dividing how you use the data, whether it's purely performance of the firm or whether it's trying to look at strategies of managing the spend as a whole. But when we do it with large insurance organizations, and even with the high volume, you're still looking at least a year before you can do anything really meaningful with it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jose, you had quite a few comments, please.
So what's really interesting is I agree with everything that everyone else is saying. And my own experience is I've seen two things kind of work, right? And they're going to sound a little strange, right? Our attorneys want no part of what the kind of data analysis that's necessary to do an empirical analysis. None of the attorneys want to do any of that work, but they would sure as heck be interested to see what the data said if someone else put it together for them, right? But they obviously, the larger the spend, they're going to want to do the qualitative reviews with the firms, particularly on what we would call cream matters, which are bet the farm matters, and core matters, which are sort of the blocking and tackling that legal departments do every day, but that are high spend matters, particularly in large commercial action pieces, right? There's two pieces that I think make sense here, and people are going to think it's funny. The first is what happens in a heavyweight championship fight, right? The announcers, someone actually looks at the punch stats. Who's landing the heavy duty blows, how many punches were thrown, how many punches landed, so on and so forth, right? And that tells a particular story. That's kind of like your data stuff. But the second group of analysts talk about what's happening in the fight between the boxers, right? Like in other words, who's imposing their will on someone else, who's getting tired, who's actually adjusting their style. And I think we have to do a blend of both. There's one sort of model that in my own career that I've seen used, which was the CompStat model in the New York City Police Department, which has been used to take a look at crime, right? And particularly the response by police commanders, precinct by precinct, to crime in their communities, right? Both from a trend analysis perspective, as well as from a reaction perspective in terms of whether they needed additional resources. The problem is most of us procurement professionals don't have a data analysis team that can put together the kind of data necessary to do this kind of what I would call evolved supplier relationship management. And Caroline, you and I have talked, and we're going to continue to talk, but I think that's where it needs to go. So that's my sense of it. What reactions?
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, I mean, I think completely agree. I think it's there's often an underestimation in how much work is involved, and then I think when the realization is there, people kind of then step back and think, oh, well, we can't do that. But I think ultimately everybody has to start considering it. It is sort of when you've got spend of a certain scale, it's something you have to do. And I think, as you say, the lawyers certainly don't want to do it. And so you need a partner potentially with someone who knows the data and knows what they're looking for. But it's yeah, you have to get that investment into the why do it in the first place across the board, because it's not something to undertake lightly, really.
I was reading on LinkedIn the story of a doctor who said that he actually employed a coach to watch him operate so that he could get better.
Yeah.
And most doctors don't think about doing that, right? But most athletes do, right? So they could get better. And I think that the coaching model is a very interesting model, right? And I think that most departments are sort of content with, well, gosh, at least we're covering things off, but nobody's focusing on how do we make this better? How do we make the delivery better? How do we, and that's the coaching model, which from sports, which I think actually bears a lot of relevance here.
I couldn't agree more, Jose, and I think I just want to put it in this room here that it requires a certain amount of how can I say, of being humble. But anyway, so that's a different discussion. I know we're almost running out of time, so if people ask if we are gonna share the slides, absolutely we will. We will post them. We will post the video. I am gonna launch, even though we're running out of time. We have actually several more polls, but I want to launch this one because I'm really interested in your answers here. Does billing compliance form part of your KPI program? Yes or no? So if you could just please vote really fast and you can see it. And thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing your insights with us. And yes, I mean, please do buy the book and read more in detail what Caroline and her team suggest. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, and if you have additional questions for Caroline, please reach out to her directly on LinkedIn. If you have suggestions for future sessions, please let us know. And again, we'll soon start to do vendor showcases or little triages. And so what do you think is the answer, Caroline, to this question? Does billing compliance form part of your KPI program? Yes or no?
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to take a gamble.
Oh, and you are so right. Look at that. 58% said yes and only 42% said no. So I think that's a pretty cool result. So anyways, thank you, everyone. Again.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. It's been great to talk. Thank you for listening.